So, Mark, one of the things Mark touched on at the end that was really important is the fact that in a lot of political science, it's very mechanistic. It's, as he said, it takes the human out of humanity. Well, history makes a really nice match for that as the other part of tonight's XSAC, because in many ways we look at some of the same areas where both disciplines are asking this fundamental question of how do humans work, what the fuck do we do, and if possible, is there a way we can do this better? But history comes at this from totally the other way. Unless, of course, you're like me and you're a political historian, in which case you're really forced to go both ways. Anyway, there are sort of three main things that I want to talk about tonight that make history important and interesting, and that historians really do, I would say, better than any other discipline. Because every discipline's got its strengths, right? That's the whole purpose of these talks. And these are what I feel histories are. So, first up, history learns really well. And learns from its mistakes, which is crucially important. Secondly, history is all about causality. And it's a very particular kind of causality that I'll get to in a moment. And lastly, history is all about people. History is all about human agency. Because at some point we remember that when you're looking at kings, what the king says, who the king is, and what the king thinks might just change things a bit. And as a result, we are forced to confront that issue in ways that a lot of other disciplines in the social sciences never really get around to. Okay, so, learning from mistakes. There is an oft-repeated quote, I think originally, but now almost just popular wisdom, that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it, or possibly just repeat the course. And this really is rather true. Among other things, history functions as a wonderful list of things that we shouldn't do again. So, Napoleon teaches us not to invade Russia. and Rommel makes really rather clear that running out of fuel halfway across Africa isn't a good way to win a war. But on a perhaps touch more serious note, and beyond the obvious military applications, which are very simple, very blunt example, learning from what we've done in the past, learning especially from the things we've screwed up, though also the things that worked, is really important. I mean, that's what makes humans different. We write things down. So, as Mark said, political science is going back 2,500 years of recorded history, long before that, of sources that we just don't have anymore. We pass on information intergenerationally. Not only do we learn from our own mistakes, every animal does that, we learn from other people's mistakes, sometimes only reluctantly. But in theory, at least, that's what we're supposed to be doing. And history is really good at that. It's, for me, history's most crucial factor, most crucial contribution is passing on those learnings. And I've got a couple of examples of this. First up, we have the Greens and Sea Shepherd. I promise I'll be bagging out the right wing just as much later on, so bear with me on this. So, what Sea Shepherd is currently doing is provoking a big confrontation with Japanese whaling ships. And they have made it into a matter of pride as to who will win. Sea Shepherd is not willing to back down, partly because of principle, but partly also because of pride. Similarly, Japan is not willing to back down because it has become a matter of international pride that they will continue whaling, that no one can make them stop. Historically speaking, this is a really stupid idea. I mean, you'd hope that any primary school teacher could tell you this just because when you've ever seen two kindergartens at loggerheads, it's much the same principle. But we have really good examples of this throughout history. And Japan, of course, provides one of the best ones, which is that at the end of World War II, Japan sent numerous messages to America saying that they were willing to surrender if the sanctity of the emperor and the emperor's position would be maintained. There's a lot of other complications as to why America wasn't willing to do this, and I'm not getting into them because it's an enormous historical debate. But this was basically the one condition that Japan had. America, for a variety of reasons, wasn't willing to accept this. They kept demanding an unconditional surrender. And it was only after America decided they were willing to accept that condition on the surrender that peace negotiations occurred productively. That decision was also partly driven by the successful detonations of 2 nuclear weapons, but from the perspective of getting talks happening and resolving the dispute, that point of compromise and, most importantly, of a face-saving way out was crucial. So when you look at what's happening with whaling at the moment, it's really clear that whaling actually isn't good for Japan. They can't sell the meat, and it's just not popular within Japan because meat is because no one wants to buy the meat. I mean, it tastes like fish. If you're going to eat something that tastes like fish, eat fish. It's much simpler. And because it has now been revealed that in order to prop up the whaling industry, funds have been diverted from things like Fukushima relief, which is not really a good look. So it's clear that if all parties were acting rationally, which is always a contested term, it would be in Japan's interests to stop whaling. But they have no way out. There's no way to save face. And this is not just a Japanese thing to save face. Everyone wants to save face. Tony Abbott can't back down from refugees because that would be a really bad look politically. He also happens to believe in that policy for assorted reasons, but either way, the main point remains, politically they're committed to that. So if Sea Shepherd and similar groups were willing to give Japan a face-saving way out, were willing to make this not about a contest of who is the most macho, you could conceivably see some negotiations occurring and an end to whaling. And that's a really important lesson to take out of history, that we have so many examples saying, give someone a way out and they'll take it. But this is one where it appears that lesson hasn't been learned. And for me, that's a really good example of where you need history, so that they can come along and say, actually, this could work better in another way. The other thing that's really important with the learning of lessons is making sure you learn the right lessons. One thing that does happen is that sometimes people will have an experience and they will take the wrong message away from it. This is because often it's hard to tell exactly what it is that's going to be useful in the next crisis, in the next situation, until that has happened. So the benefit of 2020 hindsight is always making it easier to criticize. But at the same time, it's really important to try to take those lessons out and take the right lessons out of things. And one of the examples of this comes out of the UN response to Somalia. In Somalia in the 1990s, there was an enormous civil war between different tribal groups. It was brutal, and the word genocide was being thrown around. There is still no decent internationally established definition of genocide, partly because if there were a decent definition, that could mean that countries would be compelled to act in ways they don't necessarily want to act. However, the UN went in trying to save lives, trying to do what they call the humanitarian thing and help people out. And that is a really good goal, and I fully support that goal. The way they did it, and I'm simplifying a lot here, but the way they did it was not helpful. They came across as white imperialists marching in, which was a really good way to unify all of the different groups in their loathing of the white imperialists. And thus, the UN suffered quite a few casualties, everything degenerated, and the lesson the UN took from this was that getting involved in any kind of civil war is always a bad idea. This is not necessarily wrong, but the way they subsequently applied it was not helpful. And the way we saw this applied was then subsequently in the Bosnian conflict, where much of the humanitarian response to that basically consisted of isolating the conflict, walling it off so that it didn't spread. Now, preventing a conflict from spreading is a good thing. The issue was that they prevented it from spreading, but then did not get involved to try to end it. Now, ending it would have been difficult, would have required an enormous commitment of troops, but not ending it meant allowing things like massacres in Sarajevo. However, because it didn't spread, because the UN didn't get anything like as bad a rap from that as they did from Somalia, they still got a pretty bad rap, but it wasn't in the same league as what happened with Somalia. As a result, they took that as a successful policy. They then applied it to the Rwandan genocide. And historians are pretty happy to use the word genocide there because it was an attempt to wipe out an ethnic group. The Hutus were attempting to wipe out, at least in Rwanda, and then as the civil war pulled in a couple of other nations around there, beyond the borders of Rwanda, the entire group called the Tutsis. But here, the UN's response was, again, minimalist. Only send in a token force so it looks like you're doing something, but give them instructions not to get involved, not to get in the way, and absolutely not to draw the UN into a situation that's going to hurt the UN. So there were nowhere near enough peacekeepers. And secondly, the peacekeepers were under orders not to attack, nor even to open fire to protect refugees. If the peacekeepers themselves were attacked, they could defend themselves, but frankly there weren't enough of them even to do that. And as a result, refugee camps were attacked semi-regularly. Peacekeepers were unable to prevent massacres. And this was, by all accounts, bad. And the UN lost an enormous amount of credibility over this because it was revealed that UN peacekeepers were being forced to stand by and basically watch a massacre. And this really damaged the UN's reputation, harmed their ability to help in future instances, and did not prevent 1 million people dying. That's a pretty big failure, because they were applying uncritically a lesson that they thought they had learned from Somalia, and they were not applying it in a situation that was the same. They never thought to check, is this actually the same situation? What if we did something slightly different? And what will happen if we just uncritically apply what we think we've learned? And that's where, again, for me, the historical way of thinking, looking at more than just one example, lots of examples over time, which is what historians have to do, and also applying critical thinking to say, actually, how is this going to play out? Is it going to work as nicely as we think it will? Becomes really important because it helps mean that you don't learn the wrong lessons. So, that's the first point on mistakes and learning the right lessons. The second thing that for me makes history different to a lot of other disciplines is how we deal with causality. Most disciplines are trying to explain how. Very few disciplines are happy to just say, this happened, this happened, this happened, and leave it at that. And, I mean, among other things, it's just boring. Everyone likes to know the mechanics behind things. And that's very much what history is trying to do. What we try to do is we create a narrative. We tell a story that seems plausible to us about exactly how things worked, exactly how things happened, and why they happened that way. The way we do this, though, is quite different to most of the other social sciences. Firstly, and the question was brought up at the end of Mark's speech about whether social sciences are sciences per se because they don't have experiments. Well, history really doesn't have experiments. People are understandably reluctant to let historians run experiments with countries. They seem to feel it might be problematic. And similarly, because in history you're dealing with huge, complex phenomena, so if we look at, say, World War I, there are so many factors involved in that. There's economy, there is posturing, there is the relations of the individual leaders, there is what on earth was going on with the specific terrorists that took out Franz Ferdinand, and a whole lot of other enormously complex factors in there. You can't just say, right, well, we would expect X to happen in the future, I'll look at the statistics to see whether X appears to happen. Because it's too varied, too intricate to isolate outcomes easily. And because every situation has its own factors, you can't create simple theories that way. And I appreciate that a lot of political science theories are actually incredibly complicated, in the sense in which I'm using simple is as in able to be expressed in a mathematical form. As a result of that, we can't use that kind of evidence, so we have to look for other evidence. So we look for eyewitness accounts, and we read things. We read an enormous number of things. And occasionally we even get a chance to get our hands on physical evidence. That really depends what era you're looking at. And from these, we can usually pick out a fairly uncontroversial set of events. Not always, but most of the time, the events themselves are uncontroversial. Then we have to see, well, what on earth could actually be connecting these things? From the stated motivations of the actors themselves, what looks like happening? Do their stated motivations actually make sense? If someone is telling us that they're trying to get peace, but consistently they're going to war, something is not right here. So what else could we perhaps see behind that? And the consistent thing from that is trying to tell these stories, and trying to tell these plausible stories using as much evidence as we can. And if someone finds a new piece of evidence that doesn't fit the story, then you try to see if you can fit it into the story. Or if is simply totally inconsistent with the story, but the evidence is sufficiently strong that you cannot dismiss it as aberrant, then you rewrite a new story. And that's a very different approach to the understanding of how to most other disciplines. But the other half of our method, which is my third point tonight, is human agency. Because while history argues that mostly humans are the same and are mostly comparable, we argue that not every human is the same. And history, as much as possible, really tries to look at individuals. This doesn't necessarily mean what's called great man theory. Great man theory is an older style of historical approach, which still has some currency because there are situations in which it's useful, where you start looking at just the key figures and trying to think, what were these key figures doing? How were they interacting? So if you were looking at, say, the Reformation in Europe, you'd look at Luther, you'd look at two separate popes, and you might look at Charles V, probably Philip II, and a couple of the German princes. And that would be it. So it's not necessarily that simplistic, but it is, in history, always an understanding that these are real people at play, and real people making real decisions, and these decisions are never guaranteed. There is always a potential in history that things could have gone the other way. And that really separates us from most of the other social sciences, because in most social sciences there is a tendency to adopt what we refer to as a mechanistic explanation. So when looking at forces in wider society, for example from sociology, which I'm sure we'll hear about from Kat, our president, at some point this semester, sociologists will generally talk about social structures, culture, norms, but as forces acting upon relatively passive people. The people themselves are not considered anywhere near as important as the situation in which the person finds themselves. Now, historians will still find the work of the sociologist really useful, and will bring it in so that we can understand the environment in which the person finds themselves, because there's a very different situation for, say, Julia Gillard trying to enter politics 10 years ago than say, Catherine Helen Spence trying to enter politics in the late 19th century in South Australia. Environment makes a difference here. But at the same time, we understand that Julia Gillard is an individual. And so, rather than simply looking at Gillard as the sum of a series of factors, rather than simply looking at her as a middle-class background, an immigrant, a lawyer, and a member of the ALP right, we would look at all of those things, but we would also look at her own writings, her own statements, and her stated motivations to say, well, what actually is she on about? What does she want, and how does that affect things? And this very much brings the focus back to the people. This is seen nowhere more than in what is called social history, which is all about the people. It grew out of Marxist history, which has mostly been discredited in its more extreme forms, because, funnily enough, not everything Marx said was right, but still looks at very much what is life like for an ordinary person. How do the lives of ordinary people affect events? How are the lives of ordinary people affected by events? And because history keeps that absolute focus on people, that gives us a much better respect for agency, which I think is absolutely crucial, because, as Marx said, otherwise you end up with a whole lot of nice theories that totally ignore, firstly, that there are humans who are being affected and they have moral value. And secondly, gives you real problems, because periodically a human will do something just weird and crazy, but if it's a human in a really important position, that makes a big difference. And lastly, there's just one thing that for me makes history worth studying, and that's that it's really cool. There's something fun about looking at a guy like Bismarck, who can, not quite single-handedly, but pretty close, unify Germany, break the power of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, break the power of the French Empire, and establish the world's first healthcare system. He did some good stuff. There were problems with him, but he himself was cool, and he was interesting, and that's a fun story to read. And that ultimately is why I study history, because when it comes down to it, the stories are good. Any questions?
You say in this study of history that there's a really important aspect of human agency. Where that intersects with political science, I made the point in my discussion of the Ukraine that you need one person to make a serious mistake and all this theory about what's going to happen goes out the window. In history, do you either have any examples, or could you explain what a historian's opinion on that sort of situation might be?
That one's always fun with history because it comes back to those notoriously controversial areas you pointed out before World Wars I and II, where arguably that happened. There were a couple of historians, but the most famous historian of what's called accidental history, where something just happens because somebody screws up or something random occurs that pushes people in directions they hadn't expected, was a guy called A.J.P. Taylor. He wrote about the causes of World War I and the causes of World War II, which are both hotly contested areas in history. Oxford has multiple libraries devoted to the causes of World War II. You simply can't read everything. There's not enough time in the world. He basically argued that World War II started not because Hitler was malicious, but because Hitler made a mistake in diplomacy. He waited one day too long, which meant that Britain could unify a couple of alliances, change who was making the decisions, and fix a couple of its other issues, and decide that it was willing to go to war. This particular instance of the theory has been shot to hell, because we've got a whole lot of writings of Hitler and the other key Nazis saying that they wanted war. That's pretty well established now. Similarly, for World War I, a guy called Fritz Fischer went through the German archives with the full intent to prove that it was all England's fault and that Germany had just been the innocent victim. And he came out of the German archives scratching his head and said, guys, we kind of did this and it was all our fault. And he wrote a really well-researched book demonstrating that it was all Germany's fault. But there is definitely an argument made there in terms of accidental history. And it's one of the recurring things in history that actually forces you to look at human agency, because periodically someone will do something random that has a huge effect. This can be both good and bad. So arguably World Wars I or II happened because of diplomatic failures, and that's bad. Really good thing that happened here, where it came down to one person making a judgment call, was in a thing called Operation Able Archer, which was in the 1980s. President Reagan was running war games with Europe, practicing a new signal system that was being built up. And fortunately, this operation was being run in the lead up to Russia's largest holiday, which was also the anniversary of Hitler invading the Soviet Union. And in terms of learning the wrong lessons, the USSR, from that experience, had decided that if anyone was ever going to invade the USSR, they'd do it in exactly the same way Hitler did. There are reasons why that would be a good time to invade, but if you were being sensible, why on earth would you attack when they're expecting you? So in that sense, it's less likely. But the main point was, Russia read this as being probably a cover for a real invasion or a real nuclear strike. And then, the technology Russia was using to detect nuclear launches was based on picking up the enormous light emission caused by a missile blasting off. The issue was that the computers weren't advanced enough to tell the difference between glare coming off clouds and an actual nuclear launch. So at 3 separate points on one particular evening, the evening of the anniversary of the invasion, the computers went off, picking up what the computers said were nuclear launches. One guy was on duty and had the call as to whether or not to press the button to initiate all the launches, which would have been bad. And he was looking at these photos, looking at these images, going, where are the rest of the missiles? I can't see the rest of the missiles. But that didn't necessarily mean much because they're not great quality images. He might just not be able to see them. And with 3 separate triggers, this doesn't look like an accidental thing. It's systemic. Whether that's a systemic fault or a whole lot of launches, you can't tell the difference. And in the end, he decided that it was probably a real attack. But he also decided that striking back would be really bad because then everybody but it would be morally better if at least some of the human race was alive, even if the Soviet Union was wiped off the map. So he didn't press the button. This was one guy who had a judgment call as to whether or not to end all life on this earth. And frankly, I think he made the right call. He was subsequently dismissed with dishonourable discharge because he had disobeyed protocol and had not pressed the button when the protocol said he should have. But he was also quietly thanked by the generals who said, by the way, we're really happy that we're still alive. So there, I think you've absolutely got that accidental aspect of history, which can happen for both good and bad reasons. Surely there were more flaws in what I was saying than that.
Does anyone else study history is the question.
I mean, I do, but I think...
Yeah, you've asked a question.
Well, actually, I was thinking about from the perspective of literature. We use history to sort of inform ourselves about literature in a particular period, but then we also, at least some of us, use that literature to then make statements about cultural values of that period to sort of go back in the other direction. Does this, does that happen at all in history? How much do you use literature or fiction? Or I assume it's fairly low down on the priority list, but...
It's interesting. It depends on your area. So social history uses literature a lot and uses it in a couple of different ways. Partly, if you want to know what people were thinking, you don't necessarily want to look at what they were writing for posterity, which is artificial. Science is familiar with the observer effect, the fact that you're watching it changes it. Well, when someone's writing for history, they're aware that they're being watched, they present themselves in the best possible light. You get the same thing in autobiographies. But when people are writing for each other, they tend not to do that quite as much. They do it to an extent, but it's differently done. Firstly, they can't get away with bullshit. Because if you're writing something everyone is going to read, and everyone who's in a position to call you on it is going to read, then they're going to call you on it, and you can't get away with it. So there's a degree of authenticity. Also, people write what they know. It's a truism, which, thing is though, a truism is also true, which is really important because then if you get someone like Jane Austen writing Pride and Prejudice, Northanger Abbey, a couple of others, Persuasion and so on, she's writing about a period she knows. She's criticising a particular set of social relations she knows. And that's really useful because that tells us how people at the time understood this. It's still biased as hell because it's generally only the middle and upper classes who can write, but it's much better than other things. The other reason why we tend to use literary sources is because often that's the only source we've got. Charles Dickens is one of the best sources we have for the ordinary life of the poor in his era. In fact, he's basically the only source we have. Because he was writing for the poor, he was writing from interviews with the poor, he was trying to tell the truth just through a story. As such, Dickens is really useful. He's pushing a strong political agenda, which you have to be aware of, but he's still very useful, and he can't lie too much because it's being read by people who are in a position to know. He's especially useful for, as basically the only sympathetic account you'll find from that era of what it's like to be in a prison. So if you're trying to understand what changed with penitentiaries, because there's one area of history that's really big now, ever since Michel Foucault, who has become something of the F word in large parts of history because he's almost unreadable. One of the things he talked about was there being a really big change in the way we punish people as a method of social control, which is an interesting idea. He says that rather than punishing them physically, we lock them up, we control them, we reshape them, we teach them. Well, Dickens is really useful for testing that in a lot of ways, because he says, well, actually, if you look at what's happening in these prisons, you're not teaching them anything. There is no real attempt at rehabilitation. This is just punishment, and most of the time it's still physical punishment, because there were whippings, there were floggings, there was physical isolation, there was starvation, and there were just guards being really, really brutal. You can't say that this is actually a genuine attempt at rehabilitation. That may be the shiny banner we put on top of it, that may be the theories that were popular at this time, but it wasn't the reality. So in that sense, yes, we do absolutely use literature.
Okay, thank you.